Welcome back. Um, so we're going to go over the history, development, and future of ethnic studies. The author of this piece is Evelyn Hu-DeHart. She is a PhD in Latin American history from the University of Texas at Austin. Uh, Currently working as a professor of history at Brown University, also as the director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America at Brown. She once chaired the Department of Ethnic Studies and was the director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race in America at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Her expertise is in Latin America and in Caribbean histories. And you'll notice that I often start off with who the author or authors are of a particular piece of writing before we start talking about the text, because I want you to know who you're in conversation with. As a scholar, when you're engaging other people's work, you're in dialogue with them at that point, because you're going to be thinking with them, you're going to be engaging with how they're constructing their arguments and formulating their thoughts, and you're going to be making opinions about whether or not you agree or disagree, whether or not they are credible. So it's important for you to be aware of who you're in conversation with. So I often start with the profile of the author or authors of a particular text. Okay, the history, development, and future of ethnic studies. We've watched the film. We've talked about the social and cultural events that were happening during the 50s and 60s that were in conversation with the protest movement for the establishment of ethnic studies in the academy. What is important to understand, and what was and is at the center of the continued struggle for this field in the academy, is the need for people to identify, write, and learn about their own histories. There is an old adage: history is written by the victors, which is to say that the history that we learn, the dominant history, history with a capital H, American and European histories, is grounded in the interpretations of the colonizers or the oppressors, of the people who exploited and took advantage of particular lands, including this one. It is the narrative that has been forced upon the very groups of people who are underfoot of these colonizers and oppressors. The history of the power structure is not the only or the most accurate history. It's just the one that circulates most widely. So when we are engaging the fields of ethnic studies, we are seeing the manifestation of the years of battle for representation, for shifting the lens, for usurping and upending the mainstream discourse. We're seeing and engaging with what they fought for all those decades ago. Hu-DeHart opens up this piece by giving you a brief history of the protest movement for ethnic studies, which you got a more extensive history in the videos. One of the early quotes that she writes: students of color demand better access to higher education, changes in the curriculum, the recruitment of more professors of color, and the creation of ethnic studies programs. I want to stress the importance of the student's voice in this. No other discipline has come into existence in this way. Students made these demands as a means of determining their education. It is very, very much revolutionary. It is transformative. It literally changed the academy. It changed the way that histories and social sciences were engaging with people of color. And not just in Northern California, but eventually across the United States. There are now over 700 ethnic studies programs. And with California changing its laws here recently, there will be even more. We'll see a continued growth for ethnic studies programs. This next quote: the field of ethnic studies has produced a prodigious, which means remarkable or impressive, amount of new scholarship, much of which is good and innovative. Some of the work is weak, but the perspectives of ethnic studies are intended not only to increase our knowledge base, but eventually to transform the discipline. That's to say that it is important to think about because as producers of new scholarship, ethnic studies is always evolving. It's always in conversation with current events. It's always making demands on other disciplines, on the academic institution, and on the faculty and staff alike to all be evolving, to all be in conversation with this contemporary moment, not just with histories, but seeing how the two are linked in and how the evolution of history does not necessarily mean progression without there being some significant connections and some things that don't progress at all, right? So there's a couple of key terms and phrases that she comes up with. The 5 professional associations that represent ethnic studies departments and programs. The reason why I point this out is because in the academy, professional organizations add validity to disciplines and fields of study. They are often sites where new knowledge is produced and shared, where collaborations are developed, where funding opportunities arise, publications happen there. So to be supported by professional associations is very, very important to disciplines in the university. I have a slide here about, she writes that in order to achieve a pluralistic democracy, the education system has to be reflective of that. And so first I want to explain to you what a pluralistic democracy is. A pluralistic society in general simply means that it's a society that's diverse in its people and beliefs, and that the society is accepting of that diversity. So there's social acceptance. A pluralistic democracy is one where there is diversity within political systems so that no one group dominates our political order. At its highest order, the United States is supposed to be a pluralistic society and a pluralistic democracy. She asks us or points us to area studies versus ethnic studies. She writes that the field of ethnic studies is distinct from global and international studies, particularly those programs generally known as area studies. And then she points us to area studies being like African studies, Asian studies, Latin American studies, as proposed by American imperialism, which is different from the African American studies, the Asian American studies, Chicano studies, indigenous studies that comes out of this fight that happens in the late 1960s. What develops from that fight in the late 1960s are these programs that are centered on the voices and experiences of the people who they're meant to represent. Area studies in its early iterations is the imperialistic program that is interpreting the experiences of the people that it's supposed to represent. So it's still coming from a Eurocentric lens. It's still coming from the lens of the colonizing force. Imperialism, as it stands, is a extended power over another group of people or another country. So when they develop these studies of Africa and these studies of Latin America, they were coming from it through the lens of empire, through the lens of colonizers, not from the perspective of the people. So she's making this distinction between what ethnic studies is and how it is maneuvering in the experiences and lives of the people that it is meant to represent versus these area studies that come out of imperialism. She talks about national identity and the second term, unmeltable ethnics. These two kind of go together, American national identity and unmeltable ethnics, excuse me. So for American national identity, she's arguing that European immigrants have dominated America and have been defined as the national identity of this country. So it's been very white and very Western. How that manifests is really simple, right? So when we think about how we describe communities of color in the United States, we describe them as whatever their racial ethnic makeup is American. So we would say African American or Black American. We would say Asian American. We would say Latin American. What we don't say, unless we're talking about race specifically, is white American. When we say the term American, we generally are speaking of white people. We do not say whatever their ethnic or racial makeup is and attach that as a prefix to the term American, because the national identity of this country has been European and white, and actually male. When we talk about, well, when she writes about unmeltable ethnics, what she means is that these particular markers cannot be removed or taken off. So we think of people of color always in relation to their ethnicity, always in relation to their racial makeup. And that's actually how we talk about them. If you think about most of the ways that we categorize and classify people, we classify people of color by their race and ethnicity, and we don't classify white people in America in that way. Now, we might say someone is from Europe. We might say, oh, that person is British. But generally speaking, when we're talking about, we don't say British American person, a British American person. Like we don't say it that way. Because there are some things that are assumed in the discourse of national identity. Relational and comparative approach to ethnic studies. A relational approach is a way of interacting or communicating with others that embodies core values, such as inclusiveness, honesty, compassion, and cooperative humility. Comparative approaches examines the connections between groups of people. So relational approaches is a way of interacting or communicating, and comparative approaches in ethnic studies is a way of examining those connections between groups of people. So we can think of it like comparative approaches, like when I say all people of color or marginalized people have experienced some form of oppression, but we're not going to play oppression Olympics, meaning that we're not going to battle between who has had it worse, but understanding that there are ways in which systems of domination and power have imposed upon people of color in a myriad of ways. They've imposed upon class dynamics in a myriad of ways. They've imposed upon gender in a myriad of ways, sexuality in a myriad of ways. Ethnic studies as a liberating education process. What she's saying is that it's liberating in that it challenges the things that we have accepted as fundamentally right and normal through the lens of a Western imperialist or Eurocentric framework. Western imperialism and Eurocentrism tend to claim a kind of universality of experiences. But the fact of the matter is those experiences don't actually touch people of color most of the time. There are norms or standards that are usually framed around whiteness, and they're not considering or taking into account the different experiences that people of color are having or not having in a particular situation. Ethnic studies allows us to examine those different experiences, and so it is a liberating educational process. This is an important claim that she makes on page 52, the middle column, second full paragraph down. Ethnic studies scholarship focuses on the central roles that race and ethnicity play in the construction of American history, culture, and society. Ethnic studies is interested in the ways in which we understand ourselves as a society, but not just from a narrow lens. It is looking for something that is much more plural, something that is much more multiple, something that is invested in the actual diversity of this country. Johnella Butler, head of the Department of American Ethnic Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle, writes, quote, its interdisciplinary nature, it being ethnic studies, its disciplinary nature and simultaneous attention to race, ethnicity, gender, and class should provide the scholarship and teaching necessary to illuminate it as a specific field of study, right? Ethnic studies is giving us kind of a matrix of, and this is where this matrix model comes in, a matrix of a lot of the different social markers that inform our experiences in the world. I am a Black woman, so I'm a Black person. I am a woman. I am in my 40s. There are a number of ways my age, my class, my race, my gender, my sexuality all inform and are mapped on my body, and they shape the matrix of me and how I am perceived in the world and able to move through the world. These goals of ethnic studies that Hu-DeHart points us to are very, very important. So please take note of this. Ethnic studies seeks to recover and reconstruct the history of those Americans whom history has neglected. So the history of people who aren't written or aren't written about accurately in history with a capital H. It seeks to identify and credit their contributions to the making of U.S. society and culture. So we come into like Black History Month or Mexican American Month or Chicano History Month or Pacific Islander Asian American History Month. And during those months, we might get a focus on the contributions of people of color or that particular group of color to American society. The rest of the time, we're thinking about America through a very narrow lens. The fact of the matter is, people of color have built this nation from the ground up, and so it shouldn't be limited to that one month, that few weeks that we dedicate to focusing on the contributions of people of color. If we're talking about the history of this country, then that should be folded into the entirety of the history of this country without having to separate it out. So ethnic studies is actually interested in identifying and crediting their contributions, not just as the months exist, but throughout the history and accounting of history. They're also, the goal is also to chronicle protest and resistance. This is important because oftentimes when we talk about people of color and the oppressive situations that people of color are forced into, it's often framed in a way that suggests that folks are just kind of sitting around and taking it. But in every decade of this country and every century of this country, there has been massive protest movements for freedom and liberation. There have been massive methods, or there have been multiple methods used in order to create liberation and revolutionary practices for people to get free. And so the suggestion that like even folks who were enslaved are victims of enslavement, to suggest that they were idly sitting by and allowing it to happen, really erases all of the revolutionary fight that all people of color have done in order to be recognized in this country and to experience liberation and to experience freedoms in this country. She writes, the goal is also to establish alternative values and visions, institutions, and cultures. So when we are imagining a world through a Eurocentric lens, we are imagining a world through only those value systems, only those visions, only those institutions, and only that culture. And we're not allowing any space for any diversity in those areas. So ethnic studies is interested in, or a goal of ethnic studies is to establish alternative modes of thinking, of being, of valuing, of being in our systems and institutions. And ethnic studies scholarship has become a new discipline in and of itself. It's continuing to define and clarify its own methodology and epistemology. It is about ensuring that it's not stagnant, that it doesn't become a discipline where there's a canon of the field and it never moves forward. Ethnic studies is insistent upon always developing and evolving, always enhancing its methodologies, always enhancing its epistemologies. If you did not look up epistemology, look up epistemology. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. Epistemology is how we know what we know, right? Epistemology is a key term for this course. So after she outlines this history, she outlines the development of the field, its goals. She then goes into the future of the field. And we'll just touch on this a little bit. Organizational issues are presented in the of the field. The importance of having departments in the academy. Again, in the video, I explained that having a department is central to how ethnic studies is stabilized within the academy. Being classified as a department makes it part of the stable disciplines of the academy, which helps to ensure its funding, its admissions, its hiring practices. So the other point that she makes is that as the field of ethnic studies and the discipline of ethnic studies becomes institutionalized, it will be collapsed into a multicultural kind of discourse, which is to say that it won't multicultural discourses can oftentimes conflate and collapse the experiences of different groups of people into a one blanketed people of color experience without actually pointing out or highlighting the distinct cultural and traditional lives of different groups of people. Multiculturalism can sometimes blanket everything over in that kind of, I don't know if you've ever heard the term melting pot, which is to suggest that everyone's just in this like big soup together and everyone is sharing the same kind of universal. Remember, universalism is a European um, imperialist ideology that everyone's having this universal shared experience. There's nothing wrong with us identifying the multiple experiences that people are having and respecting those experiences and learning from those experiences. Being a melting pot does nothing for addressing the actual lived experiences of different groups of people, and ethnic studies is invested in that. And that goes over the European multicultural orthodoxy as well. The inaugural vision on page 54 in the middle column, the last paragraph, last couple of sentences, she writes that the inaugural vision of ethnic studies is being part of a wide-ranging popular movement for social justice and equality for thoroughgoing social transformation. Ethnic studies is always like it cannot be understated, is always transforming itself, evolving in itself, and looking to transform society, looking to transform the academy. That is at one of the core principles, the inaugural meaning the beginning, right? Inaugural being at the beginning, the inaugural stage, the beginning stage. One of the beginning visions of it is that it is always socially aware, that it's always socially involved with the community, and that it is a transformative and has transformative prospects. I just want to talk a little bit about ethnic studies, the 10 misconception articles. Ethnic studies is not interchangeable with culturally responsive teaching. Oftentimes, culturally responsive teaching will just simply include adding a book about a particular group of people, or watching a film about the life of a particular group of people. Ethnic studies is not doing that. Ethnic studies is interested in are invested in the actual lived experiences, and thinking with and through the lenses of the people that it intends to represent. So it's not a simply a culturally responsive teaching. And there's nothing wrong with culturally responsive teaching. It's a part of helping to diversify classrooms, but culturally responsive teaching often just means including books of color, or movies of color, or materials of color, of people of color. And that's not what this is. This is focused completely through the lens and experiences of people as a first choice, not as a secondary choice. Ethnic studies is simply a version of social studies in history. They write, the underlying assumption here is the idea that the field of social studies and history as a normative practice already includes ethnic studies, and it does not. History with a capital H tends to exclude people of color's true and accurate histories. Again, history tends to be written by the victor, which means that in our case, history is written by colonizers and oppressors, and that's just the fact of, because this country develops through conquest, because European imperialist movement and colonization was a matter of conquest. That means that the histories that develop out of it about other groups of people is one that comes from the oppressor. It comes from the conqueror of the situation. And so then it becomes reductive of what ethnic studies is. Ethnic studies isn't simply revisionist. It's not just trying to change histories. It's trying to not wipe away the real accomplishments of dominant history, but actually offer a more accurate picture and experience of other people's histories and cultural experiences, because the two can exist at the same time, right? In your class in a given day, there are people who are having one kind of experience and people who are having different kinds of experience. There are people who are having different family dynamics. A lot of things can exist in a space at the same time. 3, ethnic studies has a focus on race. Race is important. That is true. Ethnic studies certainly does have an analysis of race, racialization, and racism, but ethnic studies includes an analysis of sexuality, of gender class, of ability, of age, all of the isms and all of the phobias, all of the ways in which we see domination play out on groups of people, including white people, are included in the analysis of ethnic studies. Ethnic studies teaches hate. Ethnic studies teaches students to hate whites. Worse, it teaches them to hate other groups of people. That's not true. It doesn't teach hate at all. It does teach about the realities of what's happening in the world and what people are experiencing. But this particular discourse is important because, one, it's a part of the dominant discourse that's going around about any studies of non-white experiences in this country, particularly in a lot of the Southern or Republican states, where they're saying that you can't teach certain materials in their classes or in their schools because it makes white students uncomfortable, or it makes them feel guilty, or it's generating hate, and that's not the intention or the purpose. And when ethnic studies and when ethnic studies is done well, it's definitely not pointing anyone to that to feelings of hate. It isn't invested in a feelings kind of discourse at all, actually. But as this example shows, this particular sentiment can have very, very damaging effect on the programs that exist in schools. This statement, this propaganda enabled the dismantling of the Mexican American Raza Studies program in Arizona. And it's working all over the place. We're seeing states who are banning text, who are banning certain material, banning certain discourse, all over the country. So this is really contemporary. It's very prevalent and going on right now. Ethnic Studies is a remediation program for at-risk youth. This one is so troubling for a number of reasons. Remediation programs are like intervention programs. It's when a student is falling behind on something and they need to be retaught or taught at a lower pace, slower pace for something. There's nothing wrong with it. Remediation programs are necessary, but to suggest that ethnic studies is a remediation program, one, suggests that there are some other studies like social studies or science or history that's already teaching ethnic studies, and that's not true. Two, the end of that sentence, that it's for at-risk youth suggests that one, the people who are involved in ethnic studies are people who are in trouble of some kind. So it's a pretty damning statement. It makes assumptions about folks' ability. If adopted as a graduation requirement, and it already has in California, students may not want ethnic studies. So they write, school officials and leaders have articulated this. It tends to be an argument against institutionalizing ethnic studies graduation requirements in high school. One problem with this position is that it suggests that what students are already forced to take as part of the normative and institutionalized curriculum is what students want and need. It's suggesting that students have a choice in what they take in school. And we all know, we've all been through school, that you don't have a choice. You're required to take X amount of years of English, X amount of years of math, X amount of years of histories, US history, European history. You're required to take a number of things. And at no point does anyone ask you if you are interested in what you're required to take. It's just a part of the requirements for graduation. Ethnic studies courses are successful because of teaching efficacy rather than the curriculum. So this is a tricky statement, as it provides an alternative explanation for why ethnic studies programs have been quite successful. The statement fails to understand what ethnic studies classrooms look like and how they can be transformative spaces while minimizing the value and significance of the curriculum itself. While many ethnic studies teachers may also be phenomenal educators, students seeing themselves in the curriculum deeply impacts their engagement in learning. So teacher efficacy means that it's the teacher's belief that they can achieve successful outcomes for the students, which means that the assumption is that if I believe that I can pass you, I'm going to pass you, right? And of course, I want all of you to pass, and the course is a rigorous course. The reading is rigorous. The assignments are rigorous. You're required to participate fully in the course and to learn things. This statement suggests that that's not what undergirds what happens in an ethnic studies class, that it's just the teacher's kind of desire for students to do well. The other part of that is that students really do perform better in settings when they can relate to the material. And ethnic studies often offers materials that students can relate to, and so they do better in those classes. Ethnic studies is most effective at the high school and college level. They say, we don't know if this is true or not. Current scholarship documents effective practices at the high school level. Nevertheless, to argue that ethnic studies is most effective at the secondary level presumes that A, adolescent students are more cognitively prepared for such courses, and B, that children may not grasp complex concepts or will have trouble engaging with issues of race. So there's a lot of positions that you can take on that. My personal position is that we teach all kinds of things to younger age students. We just change the language and the packaging on how we teach it in order for it to be more palatable or more easy to digest for their age range. So to suggest that you can't teach a child about or teach a child ethnic studies is kind of a moot argument, because it would just suggest that you can't teach kids anything. If you can teach kids English and writing, you can teach them ethnic studies, you just adjust it. But there's a lot of different takes on that. Number 9, college professors of ethnic studies are most qualified to teach ethnic studies courses. It's an insult to ethnic studies professors. It suggests that they are limited in what they can teach. It also suggests that other people can't learn ethnic studies, can't be engaged in ethnic studies. It suggests that high school teachers and middle school teachers don't have the qualification to teach complex and I don't know that ethnic studies is all that complex. You can have some complex approaches, but there's some basic kinds of principles, just like you teach history at different levels. You can teach ethnic studies at different levels, but it suggests that teachers outside of college professors don't have the qualifications to do that, which is a flawed argument. Ethnic studies classes, this is number 10. Ethnic studies classes may engage students, but I don't see how it addresses real learning. One of the things that I say, and I've said it in my in-person classes, and I'll say to you, that if you walk out of any class in general, but if you walk out of this ethnic studies class not having learned anything new, if you walk out with the same vocabulary that you had before, if you walk out without questioning or challenging anything about your social position, the way that you know the world, the experiences of other people, then I haven't actually taught you anything in ethnic studies. Real learning happens every day, and it happens in the classroom and it happens outside of the classroom. This statement assumes that there's only one way to learn, and there's only one very narrow scope through which you can learn things. And that's just an inaccurate and flawed statement. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this particular lecture video. I want you all to think about, I don't have anything for you to take notes on specifically, but I do want you to think about some of the misconceptions or ideas that about on these 10 misconceptions that you might have had about ethnic studies. Think about how they have come up for you in particular ways. And I will talk to you on the next video.